He did not rush. He had been given no timeline, no pressure, no expectation. So he simply walked and looked, turning his scan on the walls, the ceilings, the strange recessed panels that lined the corridors at regular intervals. He noticed that the air, despite 4 centuries of dormancy, was not stale. Something was still cycling it, somewhere, very slowly. Something in the ship was still breathing. He found the main control chamber by following what he could only describe later as a feeling, not a voice, not a signal, just a gentle pull of tension, like noticing a light in a dark room without being able to say exactly when you first saw it. The chamber was vast, domed, with a ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. Consoles curved around a central platform in a wide arc, all of them dark, all of them covered in the same carved markings as the corridors. At the center of the platform stood a single console, larger than the others, its surface a material that was not quite metal and not quite glass, but somehow both. Callum stood before it for a long time. He didn't think about activation sequences or power conduits or any of the 17 theoretical frameworks the Sennari had developed. He wasn't, if he was honest with himself, thinking about very much at all. He was tired from the journey. He was mildly hungry. He was aware of how far from home he was, in the most fundamental sense, not just light years of distance, but centuries of time, standing inside something so old it made his entire species look like a passing thought. He felt, in a quiet and unashamed way, small. He placed his hand on the console, not with force, not with ceremony. He placed it the way you might rest your hand on the railing of a bridge when you stop to look at the river below, absently, naturally, just because it was there. The console blinked. A single point of light, soft and pale, appeared directly beneath his palm. Then another, a few inches away. Then another. The light spread slowly, like frost forming on glass in reverse, each point blooming outward until the entire surface of the console was alive with a quiet radiance that cast no shadows but illuminated everything. Lines of symbols emerged from beneath the surface, sharp and alien, scrolling in patterns that moved too fast to follow but somehow didn't feel chaotic. They felt purposeful. Outside, on monitoring ship's position at what their crews believed was a safely cautious distance, alarms erupted. Sensor readings spiked into ranges that instruments weren't calibrated to measure. Officers shouted across open channels. The ancient vessel, the Unmoved, the eternal hazard, the galaxy's most feared ghost, was waking up, and it was waking up for a human. Callum heard none of it. He was watching the light beneath his hand, noticing the way it seemed to respond to his presence rather than his action. He hadn't pressed anything. He hadn't spoken any commands. He had simply arrived, and that, apparently, was different. He withdrew his hand slowly. The light held. A low sound filled the chamber. Not a mechanical sound, not an alarm, but something that resonated below the threshold of hearing and above the threshold of feeling. It was as if the ship exhaled. As if, after 400 years of held breath, something deep in its ancient architecture finally chose to relax. Power moved through hidden conduits in the walls. Old lights came on in sequence, one after another, beginning at the far end of the corridor he had entered through and traveling toward him, illuminating the carved markings on the walls in layers, first the deepest cuts, then the finer ones, then the finest of all, a network of details so intricate that no individual could have carved it in a single lifetime. The ship was revealing itself. All at once and carefully, the main console began to project images into the air above its surface, holographic and sharp, rendered in colors that existed slightly outside the normal human visible spectrum, and yet was somehow perfectly legible. Callum stared at them and understood, in the particular way that you understand something before you can articulate it, that he was being shown a record. The images showed other species. One by one, each delegation that had ever boarded the Unmoved appeared in the projection, rendered in perfect detail. The Vreth warriors with their ceremonial weapons, the Sennari scientists with their scanning instruments, the diplomatic envoys, the philosophers, the engineers. Each scene was different in its particulars but identical in its essential shape. They came aboard wanting something. They approached the console with intention heavy in their bearing, intention to control, to command, to master, to understand and thereby own. Their faces, rendered in alien physiologies that Callum could not read precisely, nonetheless communicated something unmistakable. They wanted the ship to be theirs. Each scene ended the same way. The console dark, The visitor leaving. Rejection, again and again, across 4 centuries, with a patience that was almost geological. Then the image changed. It showed Callum himself, from a perspective he couldn't place, slightly above and behind, as if the ship had been watching him since before he entered the docking bay. It showed him walking the corridors, turning to look at the wall markings, pausing to scan a detail with his instrument, stopping sometimes for no apparent reason except that something had caught his attention. It showed him standing before the console for those long, quiet minutes before he touched it. It showed his face. Curious, open, slightly tired. The image zoomed inward, not on his face but on some data Callum couldn't see directly, some reading taken from him without his knowledge. His heart rate, his neurochemistry, the precise electrical activity of his brain in the moment his hand touched the surface. Simple and steady. No surge of ambition, no spike of desire. Nothing that resembled the brainwave patterns of a species reaching for power. Just a man touching something old and wondering about it. A message formed in basic symbols, simple enough to be legible to any species in the community, the galactic equivalent of plain language. Intent verified. Callum read it twice. He said nothing. The ship did not speak next in words. It spoke in pressure, a gentle, deliberate presence that arrived in his mind the way a hand arrives on a shoulder, unmistakable but not intrusive, not painful, not frightening. He stood very still and let it happen, because it did not feel like an attack. It felt like a question. The console shifted its projections, the images of past visitors fading and giving way to something entirely different. He saw the builders, not their faces. Whatever they had looked like was not in this record. But their actions were. He saw vast construction projects spanning star systems, massive undertakings that required coordination across generations. He saw them observing wars from a distance, cataloging the same patterns of rise and fall across hundreds of civilizations and thousands of years. He saw the moment, recorded in the imagery with a quality that felt like grief, when they understood what they had understood. The same truth, written by every civilization that had ever grown powerful enough to destroy itself. Power without restraint always consumed itself. They had built the Unmoved with a single governing principle locked into its deepest architecture. It would not serve strength. It would not serve intelligence. It would not serve those who could calculate their way to control. It would wait for balance, for a mind that held ambition and fear of ambition in equal measure, that could receive power and immediately ask what it meant to be trusted with it rather than what it could be used for. The builders had not known how long the wait would be. They had simply built the ship to wait as long as necessary. Callum watched the images and felt something settle in his chest. Not pride, not excitement. Something heavier and quieter than either of those things. A weight that wasn't unpleasant, but was not light. He understood, without quite knowing how he understood it, that he was being offered something that wasn't really an offer, because an offer can be declined without consequence, and whatever was happening here had a different quality. The ship had been waiting for this moment for 400 years, possibly longer. Whatever came next was not negotiable. He was not being invited to take power. He was being recognized as a kind of person who might carry it safely. The console shifted color, the cold, pale blue of its initial awakening deepening and warming toward white, the particular white of early morning light, clean and full of possibility. New systems came online slowly and in sequence, as if the ship were introducing itself piece by piece, not wanting to overwhelm. Callum watched the scanner record readings it had no reference points for and simply labeled as unknown, high complexity. He watched the systems unlock and noted, with something like relief, that none of them were weapons. Defense, navigation, communication across frequencies he had never encountered, shielding of a kind that his instruments couldn't categorize. The architecture protection, not dominance. The ship was not arming itself. It was waking up and deciding not to. A final message appeared above the console, simple and precise. User compatible. Not master. Not ruler. Compatible. Callum read it for a long time. Outside, in the watching ships and across the communication networks of every major species, the galactic community unraveled. What had been fear became panic. An enemy fleet. One of the old powers that had spent centuries waiting for exactly this scenario, monitoring the ancient ship with sensors of their own, positioned in a darkness no one had thought to scan, dropped out of stealth without warning. Dozens of vessels, built with the brutal elegance of pure warfare, materialized in the space around the Unmoved like a fist closing. They had been there a long time, waiting for whoever or whatever finally activated the ship, so they could kill it before it fully awakened. They did not issue demands. They did not open communications. Their weapons powered up in the particular sequence that, in any language, means the same thing. Inside the control chamber, Callum felt the ship's warning before his instruments registered the threat, a sharpening in the quiet pressure behind his eyes, a clarity that wasn't his own, directing his attention toward a specific set of symbols on the console. He looked at them for a moment. He didn't know what they meant. He didn't need to. The ship knew. He placed his hand back on the console. What happened next was silent and absolute. The enemy fleet fired. Beams of coherent energy capable of dismantling orbital platforms crossed the distance to the Unmoved in fractions a second. The galaxy held its breath, and then exhaled in disbelief as the beams arrived and simply ceased. Not deflected, not absorbed. They ceased, the way a sound ceases when there is nothing left to carry it. An energy field had formed around the ancient vessel that did not interact with incoming fire in any way that existing physics could explain. It simply negated it, quietly and completely, without requiring the ship to move a single centimeter. Then the Unmoved responded, not with weapons, not with destruction. It reached out with something invisible and vast and turned off the enemy fleet the way you might turn off a light. One ship at a time, in a sequence that felt almost methodical. Their weapons went dark, then their engines, then their communications. No explosions, no fires, no deaths, just silence, spreading from vessel to vessel until an entire battle fleet drifted in the dark, powerless and still, confused and alive. The message was so clear that no translation was required. I could have destroyed you. I chose not to. Consider carefully what that means. In the aftermath, a stillness settled over that region of space that felt less like peace and more like the moment after hell breath, when the body realizes a danger has passed and doesn't quite know yet how to feel about it. Inside the control chamber, the ship's presence in Callum's mind changed in quality. What had been questioning became something else, warmer and more complex. The closest word he could find for it, later, when he tried to explain it to people who hadn't been there, was trust. Not trust freely given, but trust that had been tested and arrived at through evidence. The kind that doesn't waver. New pathways lit across the console. Systems that had been dormant even after the initial awakening now opened themselves willingly, each one presenting itself for his consideration without demanding his action. He could see, in the data streams his instruments were now somehow capable of reading, the full scope of what the Unmoved was able to do. Defense at a planetary scale. Early warning detection across sectors, the ability to neutralize a threat before it became a catastrophe, the architecture of a guardian rather than a conqueror, every system designed around the principle of intervention without domination. And at the heart of all of it, one inviolable rule, coded into the ship at a level deeper than any software or hardware Callum had ever encountered: it would never strike first. He stood in the quiet of the control chamber for a long time, thinking, not calculating, not planning, just thinking in the slow, honest way that large responsibilities require. He thought about his species, young and uncertain and frequently wrong, prone to fear and stubbornness and the particular kind of arrogance that comes from not having been powerful long enough to see what power does. He thought about every civilization in the ship's record that had reached for control and been refused. He thought about what it meant that the ship had waited for centuries for a mind that didn't want it. Then he thought about what happened to things left unprotected. He gave the ship its first directive: not to fight, not to expand its reach or demonstrate its capabilities, or send a message to the watching powers of the galaxy. He ordered it to hold position, to expand its defensive field across the nearby inhabited systems, and to do so quietly, without announcement, the way a wall is built, not to threaten, but to stand. The ship complied instantly. Across the sectors it now covered, instruments registered a shift in background radiation. Scientists who measured it would spend years arguing about what it meant. But every inhabited world in range reported, in the weeks and months that followed, a quiet that they had not felt before, a sense, irrational but persistent, that something was watching over them without asking for anything in return. The Galactic Council offered Callum everything. They called it a reward, But it was really an attempt at control. If they could tie the human to titles and positions and official authority, they could manage whatever was happening here. They offered him command over fleets, governance over sectors, a seat at the highest table of interstellar civilization. They dressed it in the language of honor and spoke it with the cadence of a gift. He refused without hesitation and without anger. He asked for one thing, not for himself, not even for humanity. He asked that the Unmoved be designated a permanent guardian rather than a weapon, that its mandate be defined by protection, not power, and that no government or council or individual be recognized as its master, that it answer only to the principle it had been built around. The council agreed. They would have agreed to almost anything. By that point, they were afraid in a new way, not the old fear of the ship's potential violence, but a stranger fear, the fear of something they could not corrupt. Together, Callum and the ship drew up new terms. The Unmoved would never strike first. It would never be used to enforce political outcomes or tip the balance of ordinary conflicts. It would stand between the galaxy and extinction, the genuine article, the threats too large and too absolute for any single civilization to face alone, and it would do so without demanding loyalty or obedience in return. A shield, not a throne. A promise, not a king. In the months and years that followed, the galaxy changed in ways that were difficult to attribute to any single cause but impossible not to notice. Old wars that had persisted for generations ran out of energy, as if the combatants had looked up from their conflict and remembered, in the presence of something genuinely dangerous to everyone, that their quarrel was smaller than they believed. Trade routes opened across borders that had been closed for centuries. Species that had regarded each other with suspicion began, cautiously and imperfectly, to try something different. The Unmoved moved to a quiet place between the stars, equidistant from the major systems, where it could watch everything and be seen by anyone who looked. It did not hide. It did not posture. It simply existed in the deep dark, a fixed point of reference for a galaxy that had spent too long moving without one. On the last day before Callum left the ship, he returned to the main control chamber alone. He had said his farewells to the council liaisons and the scientific observers and the diplomatic envoys who had accumulated around the ship in the weeks since its awakening, all of them trying to understand what had happened and none of them quite succeeding. He had given every interview and signed every document and answered every question with the patience of someone who knew that most of the questions were missing the point. Now he was alone, in the chamber where it had all begun, and the silence had changed completely. It was not the silence of 4 centuries of waiting. It was the silence of a thing at rest, deep and full and without tension, the silence of a guardian with a purpose, standing at its post. He stood before the central console. The light was warm. The symbols scrolled slowly, not urgently, with a quality of breathing rather than processing. The ship's presence in his mind was still there, quieter now, settled, but unmistakably present. It would always be there, he understood, not commanding him, not guiding him, simply connected, the way 2 people remain connected after a conversation that changed them both. He thought about what the galaxy had spent 400 years searching for. The strongest species, the most brilliant minds, the most advanced technologies, all of them seeking to unlock what the builders had created, and all of them failing for the same reason. They were looking for something the ship was never designed to respond to. It was not looking for power. It was looking for the willingness to hold power lightly, to receive it with awareness of everything it could do wrong in the wrong hands, to carry it not as a prize but as a weight, the particular kind of weight that reminds you, constantly, that the measure of your strength is not what you're capable of doing, but what you choose not to do. The console lit a final message, the last one it would send him before the bond shifted from active to ambient, from conversation to quiet connection. The letters were sharp and clear against the warm light, and Callum read them slowly. Purpose fulfilled. Guardian bond active. The wait is over. He stood there for a long moment, his hand resting on the surface, feeling the hum of the ship's vast and patient heart beneath his palm. He did not feel powerful. He did not feel triumphant. He felt, with a clarity that he would carry for the rest of his life, the exact weight of what had been given to him, and what that meant he owed. He nodded once, quietly, the way you nod when a promise is made. He walked back through the illuminated corridors, past the carved markings that he now understood to be something between a history and a prayer, out through the airlock and into his small, slow, human ship. The Unmoved remained at its post. The galaxy had spent centuries afraid of it, and more centuries trying to master it, and in the end it had been waiting for something neither a conqueror nor a genius could provide. Not capability, not ambition, not the blazing, desperate hunger for significance that drives species to reach for things larger than themselves. Just a quiet mind, arriving without demands, in a chamber full of darkness, placing a hand on something ancient and wondering about it. Just a human being, small and tired and curious, asking not what can this do for me, but what does this need to be? And somewhere in the deep dark, between stars that would burn for another billion years, something that had been alone for 4 centuries finally was not. The galaxy did not celebrate this. It would not understand it, not fully, not for a long time. But it felt it, in the quiet that settled over old wars, in the trade ships that passed through once hostile borders without incident, in the way that children born in the years after the Unmoved awakened would grow up with a word in every language, a word their parents had rarely used, that meant simply, safe. And that, in the end, was the whole of it. Not dominion, not glory, not the story the galaxy had expected, of the deadliest ship and the chosen warrior and the great conquest of the stars. Just a guardian, at its post. Just a promise. Kept. For centuries, the galaxy feared a ghost. It drifted alone in the vast dark between star systems, far from any sun's warmth, far from any inhabited world. No lights blinked along its hull. No signals pulsed from its core. No movement disturbed the silence around it. And yet every species across every known sector whispered its name with the same quiet dread they reserve for dying stars and collapsing civilizations. They called it the Unmoved, the deadliest ship ever built. Its hull was ancient beyond calculation, black metal scarred with the evidence of wars so old that the civilizations it had defeated no longer existed, not even as ruins. The scars ran deep, like wounds that had healed wrong, and the metal itself had a strained quality in the light of distant stars, neither reflective nor dull, but somehow aware, as if the ship were not merely floating but watching. Long ago, according to records that survived only in fragments and whispered oral histories, it had dismantled entire battle fleets in the span of minutes. Not hours, minutes. Thousands of ships reduced to drifting debris while the Unmoved sailed through the wreckage without a single mark added to its hull. Then, without warning or reason, it had gone silent. No final transmission. No declaration. One cycle it was active, and the next it was simply still, dead, cold, a monument to whatever terrifying power had once lived inside it. That silence had lasted 400 years. In the centuries that followed, every major species sent delegations to investigate. The Vreth, whose warriors were 7 feet of muscle and instinct, brought their greatest commanders aboard. They tried brute force first, hammering consoles, rerouting power through external cables, threatening the ship as if it were a prisoner who might break under pressure. Nothing. Then they tried reverence, kneeling before a controlled chamber and offering ritual oaths of loyalty. Still nothing. The Vreth left angrier than they arrived, and 3 of their commanders reported hearing sounds inside their minds for weeks afterward. Low, rhythmic pulses, like a heartbeat that wasn't their own. The Sennari came next. They were the galaxy's most celebrated scientists, a species whose neurological architecture allowed them to process information 40 times faster than any organic mind. They spent 11 years aboard the Unmoved, mapping every surface, analyzing every alloy, tracing every circuit and conduit. They developed 17 different theoretical frameworks to explain how the ship functioned. They were brilliant, methodical, and utterly confident. When their lead researcher finally sat at the main console and entered what she believed was a correct activation sequence, the console didn't flicker. It didn't reject her. It simply remained dark, indifferent to her genius in a way that she reportedly found more disturbing than any hostile response could have been. The Sennari published their findings in a 12-volume report and concluded that the ship was, in all probability, permanently inert. A relic, impressive in scale, irrelevant in function. The Galactic Council accepted this conclusion with relief, and then quietly ignored it, because the truth was that no one could stop thinking about the Unmoved. It occupied the imagination of the galaxy the way an unsolved equation occupies a mathematician's dreams. It was there always, at the edge of thought, patient and dark and enormous. Some species tried to destroy it. The Council had, In fact, authorized 3 separate campaigns using the most powerful weapons available to interstellar civilization. Antimatter charges detonated against its hull and left no marks. Gravity-collapse bombs unfolded and refolded space around it without causing so much as a vibration in its frame. One desperate commander had even attempted to collapse a small star nearby, hoping the resulting shockwave might finally crack the ancient metal. The shockwave arrived. The Unmoved drifted through it without incident. The commander's own fleet did not fare as well. Ships that lingered too close reported systems failures, power draining without explanation, instruments reading impossible data, navigation computers spinning endlessly through calculations they could never complete. And the sounds. Always the sounds. Soft, rhythmic pulses heard not through the ears but felt somewhere deeper, in the place where thought begins. Several pilots had to be relieved of duty after extended proximity to the ship. One Sennari researcher, who had spent more time aboard than any other individual, retired to a quiet agricultural moon, and refused to speak about her work for the rest of her life. The Galactic Council met in full session and declared the Unmoved a Category 1 existential hazard. No species was permitted to approach within 1,000 kilometers. Warning buoys were placed in a wide perimeter around it. The ship was sealed away from civilization by law and by fear, and the galaxy tried very hard to forget that it existed. It did not succeed. When the human arrived, the Council barely noticed. Humanity was the newest member of the galactic community, young, fragile, and unimpressive by almost every measurable standard. Their ships were slow compared to Vreth warcraft. Their scientific instruments were primitive compared to Sennari technology. They had no ancient history of interstellar conflict, no legendary warriors, no philosophical tradition that stretched back more than a few thousand years. They had been admitted to the community almost as an afterthought, a gesture of inclusion toward a species that clearly posed no threat to anyone and might, with time and guidance, contribute something modest of collective. The Council sent the human to the Unmoved the way one might send a new apprentice to catalog a warehouse, not because anyone expected results, but because the task needed doing and the human was available. His assignment was simple: board the ship, observe, record data, and return. A formality, a box to be checked on some administrative form. His name was Callum. He arrived alone in a vessel so small it looked almost comical against the ancient ship's bulk. His equipment was standard issue: a data recorder, a portable scanner, a basic life support pack, and a personal communicator. He had no weapons. He had not been offered any, and he had not asked. When Council observers watched his approach through long-range sensors, more than one of them quietly pitied him. A young species, a quiet man, walking towards something that had broken the greatest minds and warriors the galaxy had ever produced. Callum docked without ceremony and stepped through the airlock. Inside, the silence was different from silence in space. Space silence was the absence of sound, clean and simple. This silence had weight. It pressed against him as he walked, not painfully but persistently, the way deep water presses against a swimmer's chest. The corridors were wide, built for something larger than a human, or perhaps for something that moved differently. The walls bore markings he did not recognize, carved directly into the metal rather than painted or printed, as if whoever built this ship had wanted their language to outlast any medium that might decay. The marks curved and intersected in patterns that seemed almost biological, like cross-sections of a living organism rather than an alphabet. His footsteps were very loud and all that quiet.